Evangelical Christians as candidates, pressure groups, and voting blocs have become the most powerful new constituency on the political landscape. So said a September 21st syndicated story appearing in the nation's newspapers via the Scripps Howard News Service. Democratic pollster Paul Maslin says of the new right, quote, "They could be a critical vote and cost the Democratic Party a chance of winning substantial electoral votes in key southern and Midwestern states in 1988. We just can't write them off. There are too many of them," end quote. Democrats are worried about the new right, and they're not sure what to do. Some say the new right should be ridiculed as an insignificant segment of fanatical fundamentalists. But even liberal Senator Gary Hart of Colorado, the 1988 Democratic frontrunner, says his party should appeal to evangelicals. Will the zealotry of the new right reinstate old-fashioned traditional values or turn off voters and drive them further toward liberalism? New right delegates are expected to comprise up to 20% of those on the floor of the Republican nominating convention. And with the candidacy of Pat Robertson virtually assured, a new active phase of the religious right has been launched. The former head of the Religious Liaison Office of the White House has quit to get involved in the Robertson campaign. Why? Why the interest in Pat Robertson? Why the fervor in the new right? Well, there are some in the new right who merely want to return to societal decency. Still others with a so-called reconstructionist agenda actually believe Christians and government can usher in a kind of millennialistic reign of godly government. What's the electorate going to do? Will they respond? Will new right concerns about public schools, getting prayer back in the classroom, combating secular humanism, supporting a strong defense, and anti-communism turn on or turn off a majority of the electorate? A Wall Street Journal NBC poll revealed last July that 78% of voters said they would not vote for a candidate like Pat Robertson. Why? Because they said Pat Robertson claims to hear directly from the Lord. Does the resurgence of the new right indicate a new intolerance in America's democratic pluralism? Some think so, and they're very worried about it. Others say it's just a revival of long-forgotten values that is going to make America great again by returning to our roots. Well, many are frightened of the idea of the religious right. They see a specter of political intolerance fostered by religious zealotry, and they're very vocal about it. And right here in the state of Colorado, the Republican candidate for governor is born again, but he's also in some hot water. Ted Strickland took some heat from the press because of an interview in which he stated that America is a, quote, Christian-centered country, end quote. Well, you can imagine what happened when the liberal reporters heard that particular statement. They immediately took him to task because they said he omitted the heritage of Jewish and other religious groups. Well, Strickland was faced with a dilemma. He had to immediately address the issue. Would his religious faith make any difference in the way the governor's office would be run? Strickland said, quote, "My personal religious faith is just that, my personal religious faith. I divorce my church activities from anything I do in public or in business life." Well, those reassurances didn't settle all the qualms, as might be imagined. The issue didn't die that easily. Critics of the new religious right are particularly concerned about candidates who claim divine endorsement, and, to be fair, some in the new right worry about the thing getting carried a little too far. For example, in Gary, Indiana, William Costas, winner of the Republican congressional primary, says God told his wife the following, quote, this is the Lord speaking, supposedly, "This thing with your husband is of me, and you should encourage him to run," end quote. Well, carrying things a little bit further in Los Angeles, Rob Scribner, a House Republican candidate, said, quote, "God called on me to run for Congress," end quote. Norman Lear of People for the American Way says all of this is, quote, "a new form of religious intolerance." You may remember earlier this year having a broadcast with a debate live from Washington, D.C. at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention. John Buchanan faced off against Donald Wildman of the National Federation for Decency. Now, John Buchanan is chairman of People for the American Way. He says claims by candidates that they are backed by God, quote, suggest there's only one way for godly people to vote, end quote. But what should a Christian do? Let's suppose that you are faced with a situation. On one hand is a candidate who has a great deal of political experience, well-developed skills, an excellent educational background, and some rather conservative views that align closely to what you believe. But that individual is a humanist, a secularist, maybe even an outright atheist, or at the very least a nominal Christian. While on the other hand, the candidate who also has somewhat similar views to yours, who is born again, is lacking in educational background and commensurate political skills. Now, who are you going to vote for? Well, some say the religious right, if it prevails, is the only answer to turning back the evil tide of communism. Apparently Pat Robertson thinks so. He said, quote, we are in the midst of a profound religious revival where the Spirit of the Lord is liberty. That's why I am confident we will live to see the fall of the Soviet Union and its empire worldwide, end quote. Well, there are an awful lot of elective offices coming up for grabs during the next presidential campaign, and it's sparking fires. Many believe that a candidate's religious belief, if injected into the body politic, will become a campaign issue dividing voters along lines of denominational or philosophical differences. Will it? Well, that remains to be seen. But what really scares critics of the new right is something they call the Pray for Death movement. It got a big boost when Pat Robertson told the National Right to Life Convention that the actuarial tables would eventually take care of the liberal tilt of the Supreme Court. Now, to be fair, it was an off-the-cuff kind of statement intended as a quip with no malevolent intent. Pat Robertson was not, and certainly would not, suggest that anyone pray for the death of a Supreme Court justice. He was merely saying that some of the Supreme Court justices are up in years, and they will have to retire, or some of them may die. And the ones who are more up in years are on the liberal side of the bench in favor of abortion. Well, Reverend Joe Morecraft, a Republican candidate for Congress in suburban Atlanta, heated up things even more when he said he was praying that, quote, God would remove the Supreme Court justices who have consistently voted for the legalization of abortion, end quote. Well, one might hope they would be removed, but there's more than one way for an individual to be removed without actually praying for his death. They may retire. But, of course, the press jumped to the conclusion he wanted their death. When Justice Blackmun, who drafted the majority Roe v. Wade decision legalizing abortion, spoke at a public gathering in California, a local Baptist minister did carry things a little bit too far. He hired an airplane that was towing a sign flying through the air over the heads of the gathering, advocating prayer for Blackmun's premature demise. Well, understandably, those incidents frighten opponents of the new right. They worry about political gains made by those committed to a God and country platform, and one really can't blame them. Now, some of those gains are rather significant. Pat Robertson beat out Congressman Jack Kemp in the Michigan caucus. In Texas, the new right boasted almost half the delegates to the state GOP convention. In Nebraska and Iowa, organizers of Pat Robertson's Freedom Council have gained control of the county conventions in Lincoln, Omaha, and Des Moines, Iowa. What are the new right issues? Perhaps it would be well for us to define some of the primary concerns. The majority of people on the new right are in favor of aid to the rebel Contras in Nicaragua and, of course, opposed to the Sandinista Ortega regime. They are extremely opposed to abortion, and they want candidates in office who are going to help influence public policy in a pro-life direction. In addition, most of them, though not all, want prayer back in school. And there's extreme opposition to side issues such as the granting of civil rights status to homosexuals as a minority, and the recent Washington, D.C. district decision regarding the necessity of insurance companies providing insurance to victims of AIDS. But above all, those in the new right want to return to traditional education, traditional family values, traditional morality. Well, is the new right ever going to deploy what some say are 60 million evangelicals as a political force? Or is the religious zealotry espoused by those seeking the political holy grail going to splinter the Republican Party in the next election for president? No one really knows. But Norman Lear isn't going to sit by and do nothing. His People for the American Way plans to monitor local campaigns and defend candidates who are accused of taking positions opposed to the new right. So far, Lear's been on the losing side. Reagan is in the White House. The conservative establishment is in power in Washington. And the entire political spectrum have shifted away from the left. What does this mean? Is America on the verge of a political millennium with new right candidates restoring God to government? Well, critics of the new right say this zealotry portends an increasing intolerance for those who won't accept their political agenda. Maybe the policies and politicians of the new right have you worried, and you've got some grave concerns about those who say their backing comes from God. Well, to be honest with you, I agree. No one brings this more into focus than does Pat Robertson. With God's help, he claims to have steered hurricanes away from his Virginia Beach headquarters. With God's help, he says he's cured cancers and helped to save 600,000 souls in the last 6 years. Now Pat wants to save America. Recently, an organization called Americans for Robertson put on a nationwide live-by-satellite video conference featuring presidential hopeful Pat Robertson. It was a video conference that was designed to really kick off his presidential campaign without him officially committing himself. From the Disneyland Hotel in Anaheim to the Holiday Inn in Casper, Wyoming, and right here at the Fairmont Hotel in Denver, Colorado, plus about 200 other locations, the skeptical and the faithful gathered to hear Pat Robertson. In an invitational letter sent out under his signature, Pat Robertson called the meeting, quote, a date with destiny. He says the night was chosen because it was the 199th anniversary of the signing of the United States Constitution. Well, he got Jimmy Swaggart on his side. He jetted down to Baton Rouge to sway Swaggart, who had previously said he didn't want Robertson to campaign. Finally, Swaggart was quoted in the press as having said, "Pat is my people. I couldn't say no." There are many people worried about a Pat Robertson presidency, and not all of them are on the left. Some key supporters of vice presidential candidate George Bush have distributed a leaflet, and it's entitled, "Help Keep Religion Out of Politics." Here's what the leaflet said, quote, "Fundamentalist evangelical supporters of Reverend Pat Robertson are trying to take over the Michigan Republican Party," end quote. Well, as might be imagined, there are a number of conservative Christian leaders in Washington who immediately came to Pat's defense. They said that kind of attack on Republican religious ranks was, quote, Christian bashing, end quote. Now, Pat Robertson is a Yale Law School graduate. He's a smooth talker on television, and he's certainly capable of defending his views on budget deficits and abortion. What about this idea that a political candidate can hear directly from God? Some worry that the Almighty might awaken him in the middle of the night and tell him to drop the big one on the Russians. Well, is there a Christian vote? One organization called Christian Voice publishes what they call the Biblical Scorecard. They claim that there are at least 45 million Christian voters, and that they constitute the largest voting bloc in the land. A word needs to be said about the statistics quoted. Some have made references to a minimum of 30 million up to 45 million, and some even say 60 million born-again voters in America. Now, first of all, it's questionable whether there are actually that many born-again people in America. That generally has concluded its figures from Gallup polls and other polls which have been taken, but there are a lot of people who say they have been born again who don't have the slightest understanding of the evangelical orthodox position regarding a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. But even given that there could be as many as 20 to 25 million or 30 million, that still is a significant voting bloc. And it's a voting bloc that has a number of concerns. I've already listed some of them, but there are others as well. Beyond immediate biblical beliefs, such as abortion, they carry the agenda a lot further. Now, on the issue of abortion, it's not likely that a candidate's view is going to be swayed if he believes the Bible speaks with authority in regards to life beginning at conception. And quite frankly, this is one of the things that worries the liberal left. Their candidates tend to have a cause célèbre mentality, going from issue to issue, whatever seems to be hitting the hot button of the public. But with the religious right, it's a different matter. You're not going to find, in most cases, a sincere religious right candidate swaying in his viewpoint regarding something like abortion. Why? Well, because it's not a matter of social consensus. It's a matter of thus saith the Lord. And if he believes the Bible is God's absolute authoritative word, then he's not going to waver from his stand in that issue. What does trouble some conservative Christians is the way in which that new right agenda has been broadened to include other issues that are not necessarily quite so easily defined from a biblical standpoint, such as sanctions on South Africa. Many would tend to think that is the result of a more politically conservative rather than biblically rooted sentiment. In fact, some would suggest that the religious right has no business claiming that as part of their agenda because it places them in a position opposed to basic human rights issues and in favor of apartheid. Also, the issue of comparable worth is very important because of the anti-ERA and anti-feminist rhetoric often heard in the New Right. There's an organization that produces what they call the Biblical Scoreboard, and they tell you that what they have is basically the assessment of a, quote, pro-biblical position. Now, some say that's just a little self-righteous, to put it mildly. Is it? Is there a way to determine what a Christian ought to believe about any particular issue, no matter what? Back to Pat Robertson for a moment. There is definitely political clout behind his candidacy. He's got 30 million people hooked up to his CBN cable network and total corporate income surpassing $200 million a year for his organization. In addition to that, he's got 1 million regular contributors to his enterprise, and that's just slightly behind the Republican Party in faithful followers. He's the ultimate charismatic candidate for high office. He believes he can do the job. He says, and I quote, "I have run one of the largest nonprofit organizations in the country, and the government, regretfully, is another large nonprofit organization." In a Charisma magazine interview, Pat claimed he'd be willing to accommodate coalitions and compromise to achieve his political goals in the midst of pluralism. But what really worries people is this. If he heard the voice of God to stop that hurricane, is he going to also hear the voice of God telling him to pursue a particular course of action? Is aid to the Contras in Nicaragua equatable with healing a hernia? can he get a word of knowledge from the Lord about that? Pat has said he would overhaul the 100,000 discretionary offices in government and revolutionize the civil service laws. He says they're antiquated. Now, when it comes to this issue of mingling religion and politics, Pat Robertson says, quote, we should not use the sword of Caesar to coerce what must be a voluntary decision of the Spirit brought about by reason, end quote. That sounds good enough for me, but is it good enough for the left? What about Pat Robertson's presidency in relationship to other religious groups? Would he, or anyone like him, ever put down the heavy heel of persecution against those who are anti-Christian, or at least nominally Christian in their perspective? Well, answering that question depends on how far a new right candidate leans in defining fringe aspects of the political agenda as being God-ordained. Now, if there is a Christian constituency, there still remains the issue of deciding whether or not there is a true Christian consensus on issues like tuition tax credits for education, national defense, and freedom fighters in Angola and Afghanistan. Most of the people on the right are in favor of a strong defense. Pat Robertson says, I can't stand idly by and allow this country to be destroyed by forces aimed against it. It's time to say, we can do a better job. All right. But does that mean then he would dispatch U.S. troops to Nicaragua as God's army to subdue atheistic Marxism? I think not. But there are some concerned about it. What about the idea that comparable worth and pay equity are qualified issues on which to judge an individual's stand in relationship to political matters? Now, I'm personally opposed, for example, to teenagers receiving birth control pills at school health clinics. But there have been instances when I've had Christians call and oppose my position. Now, I disagree with them. I respect their right to differ. I personally am opposed to the sanctions vote against South Africa. I have many black listeners who feel passionately the sanctions against South Africa are necessary. What are we to do then? Is there a Christian position? Perhaps when it comes to abortion, baby doe and infanticide, yes. Assuredly, a matter like life and the pro-life position cannot have compromise. But there are other issues about which Christians have strong differences of opinion, and it would be a mistake to assume that anyone could articulate a Christian consensus. Pat Robertson told the Washington Post that according to his perception of the Constitution, quote, a Supreme Court ruling is not above the law, end quote. So the press is up in arms. They're picking on Pat for that. Well, what did they do when Franklin Delano Roosevelt said he was deliberately going to pack the Supreme Court to ram through the decisions he needed to accomplish his New Deal? Now, one doesn't have to agree with everything Pat Robertson says. On the issue of Gaddafi, he once commented that the Libyan leader should be, quote, rendered impotent by some fashion, end quote. Well, immediately the press jumped to the decision that he might rescind the executive order prohibiting assassination of leaders of public governments and public policy. But did they do the same thing when Jesse Jackson violated U.S. law and traveled all the way to Damascus to free one of our flyers? Billy Graham says that even though Pat Robertson has, quote, a great knowledge of foreign affairs, end quote, he's not going to endorse him. Why? Because Billy Graham says that a Christian in politics should be very careful about claiming God's divine endorsement. On the other hand, Tim LaHaye says, quote, The only way to have a genuine spiritual revival is to have legislative reform. Now, though Tim is a friend of mine, I find that comment, if correctly quoted, a little disturbing. I worry. The Christians can sell their collective soul to the political process and depend too much on people like Pat Robertson to get this country back where it belongs and leave God out of it in the process. There's a danger in saying that this is a Christian nation and presuming that there's a providential kind of national destiny. That could make one in public office rather arrogant regarding the use and abuse of American economic and military power. Should a Christian run for public office? Of course. Should a minister run for public office? Ah, there's the rub. Even though Jesse Jackson and the left did it. The liberals are worried that Pat Robertson will mix religion and politics. I like what William Buckley had to say in his syndicated column recently. He wrote, quote, "We are permitted to say that all the world should be fed, but if your message is that man does not live by bread alone, one draws down the curtains, closes the doors, and tiptoes out of the room, muttering that that kind of thing belongs in the home, not in the school, let alone in a legislative assembly. Freedom of religion, we need to remind ourselves, incorporates the freedom of religious advocacy." End quote. Let me repeat that line. Bill Buckley, in his syndicated column, quote, "Freedom of religion incorporates the freedom of religious advocacy." End quote. I might add, those who are worried about Pat Robertson's religious convictions should consider that they have been untroubled by the secular evangelism of humanistic principles. I'll tell you what really worries them is that Christians believe they found the truth. And that surety is troubling to them. Problem is, secular humanists aren't sure what they found, and they really don't know what to say or what to advocate. So, understandably, they're bothered when someone comes along and says, "This is what I believe. This is what we should do."
This is the end of Side 1. Please turn the cassette over at this point for the continuation of the message on Side 2.
I find myself ambivalent to some extent. On one hand, I am thrilled to see the activism of Christians, a new kind of commitment to getting involved in politics. I remember when I first became a Christian, politics was a dirty word. Ministers told jokes about dirty politicians, and the general consensus was that if you got into politics, you couldn't really be saved and separate from the world. Well, where did that attitude get us? It got us abortion on demand, TM taught in our schools, prayer removed and the Ten Commandments down from our walls, and contraceptions passed around the hallways along with drugs. That's where it got us. Thank God Christians are now concerned. They want to know who the candidates are, where they stand on the issues. There are some things about which we should caution ourselves. One, don't determine there is a Christian consensus. There is such a thing as a Christian feminist, and yes, there are even Christian peace advocates. And they too love the Lord. They may be for unilateral disarmament, or a scaling down of the arms race, or they may hold an anti-nuke position, or, perish the thought, they might be in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. That doesn't make them non-Christian. They can be biblically based in terms of the Holy Scriptures without necessarily holding to a relativistic social agenda that is culturally defined at this current milieu in history as being Christian. It does disturb me when I hear Christians articulate what they say is the Christian position, because I don't believe there is one except on a few selected issues such as abortion. On the other hand, there is a danger that Christians will not seize a marvelous opportunity to make their voices heard. Someone's got to do it, and Pat Robertson may be the man. Admittedly, I was extremely troubled seeing his video conference and watching a prepared video clip, as well as listening to the people who introduced Pat and hearing them articulate again and again, this is the man God has ordained to be the next president. Some of them said those very words. That troubled me. It troubled me that some of the video clips said that, because that video clip was prepared in advance. Whether or not the speeches of those who introduced Pat were cleared with his advisors, I don't know. I suspect they were. And it bothers me that they endorsed him as God's man and the only one capable of saving America in this hour. Do you know it's possible? God could use a non-Christian in the Oval Office who abides by basic biblical values to turn this country around. For there are ethical considerations that are common with non-Christians. Evangelicalism listened to Jimmy Carter because he said he was born again. And then he couldn't even get a helicopter to land in the Iranian desert. And brought us nearly 20% inflation that robbed the gospel, robbed missionaries, and severely constricted the opportunities of evangelism. Was he God's man? Or was he a sincere, born-again man without the political abilities to manage the highest office in the land? Would we have been better with a non-Christian in office if a non-Christian had been running against him who abided by biblical considerations? Some Christians believe that though Jimmy Carter was born again, his economic policies were not Bible-centered. What if a candidate were to have Bible-centered economic policies and yet not believe in the deity of Jesus Christ? A word of caution I would add when it comes to mixing religion and politics is this. Vote for the candidate who is best qualified for the office and who holds to the positions more closely aligned with what you believe will bring this country back to its Judeo-Christian rootings. But be cautious. The candidate doesn't ring your political bell by saying the kinds of things he knows the new right wants to hear, because he understands they are a voting bloc, while at the same time does not really adhere to the ethical pursuit of those things which will fundamentally restore our society. Lynn Nopzinger is a former White House advisor, and he spoke recently at a seminar and expressed some concerns regarding anti-New Right rhetoric. He makes a good point. He says Pat Robertson has come in for a lot more criticism than others who have mixed religion and politics, like Jesse Jackson. Nopzinger said, "You are seeing a visible press bias against right-wing radio ministries." End quote. Just as the New Right adheres to a philosophy that America has a distinct Judeo-Christian heritage and will someday be restored to this foundation, keep in mind, there are other evangelicals who believe the United States is hypocritical, corrupt, selfish, and immoral. They say that pious language about a Judeo-Christian heritage is meant to mask capitalistic lust for wealth and self-interest. They say the result will be an idolatrous self-exaltation that misses the mark of true Christian patriotism, which is, after all, calling the country to repent of its sins. We need the balance of both. The voice of the prophet saying, "Repent, America," as well as the voice of the politician who says, "I still believe in this country." Lincoln called America the last best hope of the earth, the almost chosen people. Now, that view stirs patriotic sentiment, But we must be careful lest we quote Lincoln as if to add, "Thus saith the Lord," on behalf of American political policy. Affirming Christian patriotism for America and praying for special national direction is one thing. But, friend, it's quite another to consider our country the messianic fulfillment of good government. The danger is we will misplace our loyalties in favor of the Statue of Liberty rather than the cross of Christ. The cross of Christ must be foremost. Because of the conspicuous Christian presence in our country's history, some have concluded the story of our land is merely an extension of the history of salvation. In fact, the Puritans felt God had established a special covenant with their New World settlement. Those who revere such historical traditions may be historically accurate, but they run the risk that their loyalty to this land may be more than the common affection most people have as part of nationalistic devotion. You need to beware lest national loyalty could turn into a kind of divine worship of the fatherland, in effect putting another God before Jehovah. There are many Christians who quote 2 Chronicles 7:14 regarding national humility, restoration. If my people which are called by my name will humble themselves, if they will seek my face, I will heal their land. But Old Testament Israel, keep in mind, is the only nation in history enjoying unique divine favor. And we've got to be careful. It distorts God's word to conclude that the special dispensation theocratically accorded Israel through the Old Testament applies to America. Now, there's nothing wrong with patriotic loyalty, but the highest loyalty of Christians should belong to the blood-bought nation of the redeemed, the nation of peculiar people of whom the Apostle Peter speaks. America is not a theocracy. God doesn't sit in the Oval Office. A man does. Yes, we have a Judeo-Christian heritage. Yes, we have values firmly entrenched in this society, which contains metaphors and allusions to scriptural references. It embeds the subconscious of the American mind. But that doesn't make us a Christian nation. It's relatively easy for the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, to conclude that the United States is God's nation. But that assertion doesn't necessarily meet with agreement from other minorities, blacks, for example, who still experience the destructive effects of systematic national discrimination. What about the poor? Many of them have yet to eat their piece of pie baked in the oven of a free market economy. And sometimes the poor, blacks, other minorities, criticize this country. That shouldn't be seen as unpatriotic or unchristian. Do we need to be reminded? This great country instigated genocide against its native citizens, and it enslaved those who were shipped here to work in its cotton fields. I love America. I want you to love this land. We should fight for what is right. We should thank God for our historic commitment to responsible freedom under God. We should vote for the candidate who is best qualified for the office. And if that man is Pat Robertson or someone else, then it should be determined on the basis of his position on the issues, his training, background, and experience, and proven capabilities in the heat of the political process. But let's be careful about bringing back any religious intolerance that would mock the very reason our founding fathers came to this land to escape persecution. The new right political agenda may approximate scriptural principles in some cases. But let's be careful, very, very careful, lest we presume it has divine endorsement. That would be scripturally inappropriate, and it would be politically suicidal.
This is the end of the message. For further information regarding other topics available on cassette and in printed form, write Bob Larson Ministries, Box 36A, Denver, Colorado, 80236.